Massive orders to buy new airplanes are placed as this year's Farnborough Airshow kicks off. Purchasers compete for state-of-the-art products of top makers Boeing and Airbus. Is this a sign of wider economic recovery, or could it result in one, at least for the aviation industry? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. The aviation industry looks set to take off after a two-year slump, expecting a smooth ride through 2010. Big players in the airline business seemed optimistic as they gathered for the week-long Farnborough Airshow in the UK. With arch rivals Boeing and Airbus showing off their new models, many pegged Boeing's new 787 Dreamliner as the star of the show. Claimed to be greener than its rivals, the plane has made its international debut at Farnborough. It's said to be capable of flying long-haul routes with up to 20% less fuel. With the economy appearing to be recovering slowly, analysts predict growth in the airline industry will be quite restrained in the medium term. But both Boeing and Airbus are expecting 2010 to be a year of substantial orders. They're expecting faster-growing economies of Asia, Latin America and the Middle East to be accountable for the bulk of the growth. The traditionally big markets, that of the US and Europe, are likely to contribute less in comparison. And as established airlines struggle to recover from losses suffered in past years, analysts expect leasing companies to increasingly be the big buyers. Well, joining me to discuss the topic, in Farnborough, Alan Peaford, editor of Arabian Aerospace. In London, Richard Abalafia, Vice President of Teal Group Corporation. And in Washington, D.C., Ben Mutsaba, writer of the Today in the Sky blog in the USA Today newspaper. Let's begin at Farnborough. And Alan Peaford, if you can hear us with all those aircraft flying in the background, there seems to be a lot of optimism flying around there. Is it justified?
Hi, mate. Well, you can hear me, I hope, with all the noise going on. I think the optimism is justified in the longer term. Certainly there's a lot of interest going on at the moment with some of the carriers from those emerging markets that we're seeing coming here and looking at the new aircraft. So I think you're right, there is optimism certainly in the longer term and for some places in the medium term too.
Richard Abalafia in London, your view, is this optimism justified at this stage?
Well, right now you're looking at some very strong traffic numbers. They're well into the double digits, which means a very good recovery. What we've got in the background, however, is a lot of economic uncertainty and doubt, talk of Eurozone contagion spreading, talk of a possible, hopefully remote possibility of a double-dip recession in the U.S. and Europe. Doubts as to how sustainable the current economic recovery is. But stepping aside for a moment, just looking at the traffic numbers, they're really quite good, and they make for a strong recovery and therefore a lot more interest in the aircraft that serve those markets.
Well, Ben Mutsaba in Washington, D.C., the airline industry has a long lead in terms of economic recovery. These orders are placed years before the actual physical taking off what is being bought. Do you see this recovery as something lasting? The optimism that we've seen there, is it correctly placed?
I think so, and of course I have to echo Richard's thoughts that, you know, there's a lot of economic uncertainty. Any one thing could derail any momentum, or, you know, not expected drop in costs could push things in the other direction. But, you know, I think here in North America, the airline industry here cut a lot earlier than in other parts of the world, faced with some unique circumstances that hit the United States and Canada, perhaps for the rest of the world. So the airlines here are finally starting to regain their footing, and it seems reasonable that if this recovery lasts, say, into the next year, then I think it does stand to reason that the airlines in North America could start to look at some new orders and potentially some substantial new orders as they look for more efficient aircraft that better fit their fleets going forward.
Richard Abalafia in London, we heard that the initial buyers very strongly from the Middle East. We're seeing an emerging powerhouse market there. Is this a temporary phenomenon, or is it actually a massive and lasting reorientation of markets in the airline industry?
Well, that's probably the biggest single question in the aviation industry today. You do have this this phenomenon that's been underway for a few years now with the 5th and 6th Freedom flag carriers of obviously Qatar, Emirates, and Etihad really increasing their market share of the global aviation industry. And of course, very little of that is actual origin and destination traffic. A lot of it is traffic siphoned off between the U.S. and Europe from the traditional legacy carriers. And that's fine. They offer good value, good money. Yeah, they can do that. Will the growth continue at these tremendous breakneck paces they've been enjoying? Well, that, of course, is a question of industrial policy, of strategy for the companies and countries behind them. I suspect you are looking at something of a permanent shift, though, yes.
Well, Alan Peaford, this question, are these emerging airline giants in the Middle East, are they siphoning off the customers from, as we heard there, the traditional giants, or is the market itself increasing? Are more people wanting to fly? Which way is this going?
Well, certainly the airlines of the Middle East, or certainly the Gulf particularly, have picked up on this strategy of working through the hubs of Doha and Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And at the moment, they've been investing and picking up the new aircraft to get to places like Asia and Africa with that through traffic, and have really started to dominate away from some of the traditional carriers. And that's the way they've built the strategy. And I don't think we're going to see airlines like Emirates buying any more after today. They've made another major order today, but I don't think you're going to see a lot more of that. Qatar and Etihad have ways to go. But I think you're also going to see something coming from players like Egypt Air, where if you think about it, only 10% of people in Egypt have ever flown before. So there's huge markets in the domestic side and the people there that are going to be flying onto Europe and into Asia. So I think seeing the Middle Eastern carriers is something that's going to grow and grow.
Well, Ben Mutsaba in Washington, D.C., is this a geographical reason, looking at these airlines such as Qatar Airways, Emirates, potentially Egypt Air? These airlines are, in a way, geographically far more central hubs than the traditional carriers based in the US or in Europe. Is this a primary reason, the geographical location of these airlines, or is it something that they are doing smarter and better?
Well, you know, I think as with most things, it's probably a combination of all of those, but I don't think you can downplay at all how significant the location of these hubs are. And I think it's been part of the strategy of the carriers that operate from these hubs to argue that, hey, look, we've got a great product, and it makes more sense if you're going to India, South Asia, or Africa to connect through Dubai or Doha instead of Frankfurt or London. And so far, they seem to be making a pretty compelling case, as evidenced by consumers' behavior about getting people to make those connections. And to the point you raised earlier, you know, I think so far there's been an interesting shift away maybe from some of the traditional hubs in Europe for connections between North America and Europe and South Asia and Africa. And I think they've probably also stimulated some demand, and to the point they can do the latter even better for those carriers. But at some point, as far as fighting for market share, there's only a finite market without stimulating new demand. And I would have to wonder if some of these routes are maybe, for connecting passengers, are permanently shifting from places like Frankfurt and Paris to the Middle East. And that's not to say that only one can survive, but some of the routes, traditional routes, might become a little more thin, and some of them, but certainly not all of them, might go away in favor of Dubai and Doha, etc.
Well, let's just pause here and take a look at the situation in the industry. Last year, the aviation industry lost $9.4 billion. But following sustained economic recovery, last month the International Air Transport Association, IATA, reassessed and projected a $2.5 billion profit for 2010. Analysts expect Asia and North America to lead, while Europe struggles to keep up, with airline strikes, the debt crisis, and the effects of the volcanic ash cloud all having an impact. Giovanni Bissagnani, CEO of IATA, however, remains optimistic. He said, "The global economy is recovering from the depths of the financial crisis much more quickly than could have been anticipated. Airlines are benefiting from a strong traffic rebound that is pushing the industry into the black." Now, the major question here, Ben Mutsaba in Washington, D.C., is all of this going to benefit the person who keeps the airlines aloft, the passenger? Is he or she going to be paying less because of this economic improvement?
Well, I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out over time. Clearly, the faster and stronger any rebound in demand is, it certainly increases the airline's ability to raise fares. In the United States, perhaps more uniquely than any other country, we have a very strong presence of discount carriers domestically. So it's still going to be very hard for the so-called legacy carriers to raise fares substantially within the United States on non-business focused routes. But transatlantically, transpacifically, on overseas routes, they probably will be able to raise fares. I think once you start to take a longer term view of this, I think the question or when you ask about whether passengers are better served, is do you want lower fares or better service? And at least speaking from the perspective of North American airlines, the service could certainly be improved relative to airlines like Emirates and Singapore. So there's a way to go in that area, but if lower fares to London is a priority or lower fares to Singapore or Australia is a priority, then you're going to have to cut a little bit in service. So I guess a lot of that depends on what the customers are hoping for. Lower fares or better service, and it's my guess they're hoping for something in the middle.
Well, Alan Peaford at Farnborough, that's an interesting point. From those selling aircraft there, from those buying them, what do they think the consumer is looking for? Better service or lower fares or the combination?
I think you're looking at two different things, and I think you're going to get some people who will be looking for the lower costs, and certainly in the Middle East we're seeing a kind of rapid growth of low-cost carriers coming through for people that just want to go from one city to the other fairly quickly. There are still a lot of people doing business on the long hauls, and what you're seeing with the new aircraft, and certainly the way the carriers are moving, ideas towards more space, and that space isn't necessarily coming from longer aeroplanes, it's coming from better equipped cabins, and the new designs and the lighter weight cabins are giving people more space. So the yields remain the same, but you can actually get more space. And I think we'll start seeing airlines again trying to differentiate on the quality, but perhaps the quality further back in the cabin, not just at the front end.
Yes, well, let's put that to Richard Abulafia in London. We've heard that Emirates, for example, has bought 30 Boeing 777 jets, but this is just a month after it actually placed one of the biggest orders ever, and that is for 32 Airbus super jumbos. Now, hearing that point that Alan Peaford made about the increasing quality of the inside of aircraft, the greater comfort for the passenger, how big a part of airline development and progress is this playing, the whole question of greater comfort?
Well, I take just a small, gentle exception to Dallon's comments about the back of the cabin. I'm afraid what we're seeing is continued bifurcation in pricing models and strategies. The front of the cabin, absolutely right, better and better, because high margin front of cabin premium traffic is something that everyone wants. That's where you make your money, possibly more than 100% of the total profit. You might be losing money on the back end. And that is just getting more and more lie-flat seats, better in-flight entertainment, a generally much better flying experience. And again, those Middle Eastern carriers, along with the Asian carriers, have definitely led the way in that department. The back, not so much. I don't think you're seeing any kind of improvement. As a matter of fact, on the domestic markets, back of cabin, with the increased penetration of low-cost carriers, if anything, it's getting a little bit more miserable. The only hope is that I think you're getting airlines that are better able to strategize on pricing models, and they're introducing things like Economy Plus, where if you pay a little more, you get a bit more legroom, not much, just a little bit more. You don't have to pay the 4 times multiple for business class, but you get a little something for the price. But if you're in the traditional lowest fare, way back of cabin, I think life is pretty much just about the same.
Well, Ben Mutsaba in Washington, D.C., that point about perhaps conditions improving for payment of a little bit more. Every person who's checked into an economy airline fighting for emergency rows, for example. Is it likely that this could be a trend that one is seeing, particularly in domestic flights, that for a little bit more money, the passenger can travel in a little bit more comfort?
I think so, and in no small part because the airlines are looking for any incremental part of flying that customers are willing to pay more for, that doesn't necessarily increase an airline's cost. Now, of course, to add these so-called economy plus seats, which is what United calls it here in the United States, you'll have to, modify the configuration of your jets a little bit, of your aircraft somewhat. But, I think it'll be really interesting to see what United does, assuming that its merger with Continental is approved by regulators here, because, of course, United has an Economy Plus product where you have about 6 extra inches of legroom in front of you. May not sound like a lot, but I like to argue it's the difference between being able to comfortably open your laptop in your seat or not. And Continental does not offer that. So as they merge their product and decide which of their features they're going to keep, will be interesting to see if the airline decides to keep Economy Plus or go with a pretty standard coach class experience. It's my guess, or just a guess, that United, the new United, will opt to keep Economy Plus. And I think if they do, and perhaps even if they don't, but especially if they do, it will be a bellwether for what the rest of the industry is going to do. People will see that this has been successful for United, and whether it's American, Air Canada, or overseas carriers, I think they'll look even more at this idea and see how much extra they can get out of passengers. And, a lot of passengers think it's a good value.
Helen Peaford at Farnborough, staying with this particular topic, the improvement of conditions for the passengers. We've heard much about the design changes, about new technologies. The Dreamliner, for example, 20% less fuel consumption. The insides of the aircraft themselves fitted out with lightweight materials. Everything perhaps more technically advanced. Does this mean a better experience for passengers? And I'm staying with passengers because they are the ones who are most interested in what is happening in these civilian aircraft.
It can make a big difference, and I think one of the sad things in the aviation industry is there's not one single airline amongst the top brands in the world, and I think that says a lot when you're looking at the popular buyers or the popular users of aircraft. Now, when you're looking at the new aircraft, and certainly even the new 777s, and I flew on the Egypt Air economy class just a couple of weeks ago to try it out, and it's pretty good. Once you start getting the connectivity and the IFE, as Richard was talking about, the in-flight entertainment, if you can get that and you can keep people entertained for the long haul, if they can use their laptops or their Blackberries and keep in touch with their friends through Facebook, you're starting to get a better experience. If you can get your videos on demand and your seats, which may be a lot lighter and may give you space, it doesn't need necessarily more leg room in order to give you more space. And I think as the airlines focus on their passengers again, at the same time as, of course, the way it's helping us on the environmental issues. But when they start doing that, I think we might start seeing airlines getting themselves better in the brand recognition areas.
Richard Avalafia, do you think that it is time that airlines started concentrating on their passengers again rather than on profits or lack of them?
Oh, very definitely. But of course, a lot of carriers are relatively short-sighted, focused more on profit than on market share or on anything associated with customer loyalty. In a lot of ways, the legacy carriers have come to view air travel as a commodity market, and internet pricing really hasn't helped that at all. People tend to migrate to the lowest price click there when they look for a ticket. Internationally, though, you're seeing a bit of recognition that the global carriers that have worked on brand improvement, whether it's Emirates or Virgin or Singapore, really have garnered benefits in terms of better pricing, in terms of, well, just generally faster growth. And I think there probably will be greater recognition of that. Hopefully that will improve the passenger experience as well.
Yes, Ben, what's about in Washington to follow on to that point? It does appear that those airlines that are doing better are those that are providing more for the passengers. Is a better flight experience going to result to greater profits for the airlines, which would benefit all?
No, I think that's an excellent question, because I think we all want to say yes, but at the end of the day, back to the comment about the transparency of internet pricing, if one flight is $280 or whatever the local currency is, and the next one is $289, how many people are going to click the cheapest one just because it's cheaper, even if it's only a few dollars, a few pounds, a few euros, what have you? So I think that's the real question. Now the trick is, if you're an airline, can you deliver a service that's tangible enough that you'll be able to entice your customers to pay an extra 10, 20, 30 of whatever the local currency is to to buy that service, essentially. And I think you're starting to see that happen even here in the United States. JetBlue is what we would call a low-cost carrier here, but their service is pretty upscale. And I think we've seen over the past 6 to 8 quarters, they've actually been able to get a pretty decent yield out of their passengers who are willing to pay for a service that's considered to be somewhat nicer than the average domestic product. There's also the problem of competing interests for public companies. You're facing shareholder demands for a return on their investment, and you're facing customer demands for a better product. And while I agree that focusing solely on shareholder demands for a return is short-sighted, in that if you make your product so bad no one wants to fly it, it ultimately all falls apart, it's a problem for a lot of the CEOs, especially at carriers where they've been financially crunched. So there are competing interests, but I think at the end of the day, it's hard to argue that treating the customers better, hard not to argue that treating the customers better will make your airline more profitable in the long run.
Richard Abalafia, we've been talking about the giants, predominantly Boeing and Airbus, but we've seen as well in this show very early some of the newer manufacturers coming through. We've seen Qatar Airlines, for example, having placed an order for some jets from Bombardier, a Canadian company. Is the competition within the manufacturers getting stronger? And if so, what impact will this have on the consumer?
Well, it might. At the bottom end of the market, for example, that Bombardier plane, that extends up to 230 seats, which isn't really very much of the market, frankly. 95% of the market by value is above that. But it will be interesting to see where it goes. Right now, once you remove that Bombardier plane, there's absolutely nothing about ordering trends that clearly indicates an interest in someone beyond Airbus and Boeing serving this market. There's certainly talk, a lot of it government funded in China and Russia, about getting into the aerospace industry, but frankly, government-run manufacturing concerns don't do a very good job of meeting consumer needs. Still, there is the hope that something emerges, that something happens out of this, and better planes result. It's sort of interesting, in Japan, there's the new Mitsubishi regional jet, and that's a private sector initiative, and that might produce more competition and a better class of regional jet. Overall, you've seen in the regional jet marketplace new competition. 10 years or 12 years ago, Embraer got into the market for larger regional jets and made that a better place from the passenger experience standpoint. So there's hope, but almost all of it so far has been in the smaller part of the business where, again, it's only a couple % of the total value.
Alan Peaford, would you like to follow up on that? Any signs of a wider or larger breakthrough by the smaller aircraft manufacturers?
Well, I think if you take the Bombardier one, first of all, I mean, that was interesting that the Qatar Airways purchase today was looking more at the business class side and how they're going to take their top premium passengers around. But Bombardier, of course, are looking at what's called the C-Series aircraft, which is pushing very much into the Boeing and Airbus territory with more than 100 seats. So they're stepping up from where Embraer and Bombardier have been before. But we've seen Embraer coming into companies like Royal Jordanian and Gulf Air now. So they're picking up on that regional market only. What's going to be really interesting is when aircraft like the C-Series come in, when the Russians start coming in to compete with the narrow bodies from Bombardier and Airbus, and what happens in those countries in the world that don't necessarily have a good relationship with either Europe or the US, and whether we can see markets being created for them, whether that's in India, in China itself, or in some of the other Asian or African countries.
Well, interesting developments in the months and years to come in the airline industry, and hopefully improvements too for those who fly on the aircraft. My thanks to our guests, Alan Peaford at Farnborough, Richard Abalafia in London, and Ben Mutsaba in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.